Have you ever heard of a Brazilian city where German is spoken on a daily basis? Well, in the south of the country, there is a small city that preserves traditions that are not even so present in Germany itself. A place that has become a tourist attraction, a cultural showcase, and a source of local pride. But it also arouses contradictions, cultural clashes, and even harsh criticism from German visitors. Today, Bello Mundo will take you to Pomerode, the most German town in Brazil, and perhaps one of the most contradictory. Brazil is so large that it looks like a mosaic of different peoples fitted into the same map. In the north, the tone was set mainly by indigenous peoples mixed with Portuguese colonizers, and later with descendants of Africans brought there by force. Riverside communities sprang up on the banks of rivers, where the caboclo's face is a direct result of this meeting of ethnic groups. In the northeast, the mix took on a different character. The Portuguese influence remained strong, but the African presence was much more intense there, due to the sugar mills and ports in cities such as Salvador and Recife. Added to this were the indigenous peoples who already lived in the region. The result can be seen in the skin, the music, the food with palm oil, the drawn-out accents, and the popular religion that mixes European, African, and native elements. In the southeast, things got even more mixed up. First came the Portuguese en masse, then Italians to work on coffee farms, Spaniards, Germans, Japanese, Syrians, Lebanese, and so many people from other corners of the world that São Paulo became synonymous with immigrant city. To this day, entire neighborhoods bear the distinct marks of each of these communities. In the Midwest, the scenario is different. Ancient indigenous peoples, such as the Cervantes and Terrenas, coexisted with the arrival of Gauchos, Paulistas, and Paranaenses, who advanced the agricultural frontier, in addition to the construction of Brasilia, which attracted workers from all over the country. It is a region where the face of Brazil is a great internal encounter, and down south the mix changes again. In addition to the Portuguese and the indigenous peoples who already lived there, Germans, Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, and other European groups arrived and created entire colonies with their own language, religion, and customs. It is in this part of the map that Santa Catarina is located, a state where the German heritage appears in the festivals, surnames, and in several cities. Blumenau became famous for Oktoberfest and German colonization, but the title of most German city in Brazil ended up going to another place nearby. That place is Pomerode, a small city in the Itajaí Valley that many people see as a piece of Germany tucked away inside Brazil. However, before it became a tourist attraction and earned this nickname, all that existed there was dense forest, a narrow river, and the promise of land for those who agreed to start over far from Pomerania. It is at this turning point that the story of the founding of Pomerode begins. When the first Pomeranian groups landed in Blumenau, Brazil still seemed too distant a territory for those coming from northern Germany. The journey took weeks on cramped ships, with entire families squeezed between suitcases, animals, and the uncertainty of what they would find on the other side of the ocean. But the promise of their own land spoke louder than fear. Blumenau served as a kind of initial base. Women and children stayed in temporary houses, while men were taken inland to choose the plots they would receive from the government. These plots were scattered along what would later be called the Testo River Valley, a region of dense forest, damp ground, and deep silence. To transform that space into housing, the settlers needed to clear the land, cut down huge trees, and build their first simple houses of wattle and daub, covered with palm leaves. Gradually, they moved up the river and occupied higher areas. This process was led by Ferdinand Hackrat, who decided to follow the tributaries of the Itajaí until he found a place where families could settle with some security. It was there that the first houses, the first farms, and the first German school were established in the 1870s. The name of the river that cut through the region came from an indigenous term related to broken ceramic utensils, which were thrown into the water by the native peoples. The name of the future city, on the other hand, has two possible explanations. Some say it came from Pomerode, the local stream. Others claim it was born from the union of Pomerode, the settlers' homeland, with the verb rodern, which means to clear the land for planting. Either way, the name bears the mark of those who arrived there to start over. Over time, the makeshift wattle and daub houses began to give way to a type of construction that is now the great postcard image of Pomerode. Pomeranian families brought from Europe a technique called half-timbering, which uses wooden beams fitted together to form the structure of the house. Instead of nails, everything was fixed with precise cuts in the wood, and the walls, when not made entirely of wood, were filled with clay, mud, and stone. The curious thing is that, for these families, half-timbering was not an architectural style. It was simply the right way to build. Each beam was numbered with Roman numerals so that the house could be assembled and disassembled if the family decided to move. This explains why so many 19th century buildings have remained intact to this day. They were built to last and, above all, to survive the typical displacements of the early decades of colonization. With the development of the city, these houses spread throughout the valley. Some became famous and ended up being listed as cultural heritage sites. The Reduns House and the Seward House are two examples of how architecture has become living history. The Radens House, for example, is a half-timbered house over a century old that still houses furniture, objects, and photos of the family that has lived there since the time of colonization. Today, the descendants themselves welcome visitors and tell them what daily life was like in the valley before the city existed. The Casa Seward, built in the early 20th century, shows the other side of this story. It preserves tools, agricultural implements, and documents that help to understand how the settlers' work routine functioned. These and many other buildings are part of the half-timbered route, considered the largest collection of this type of architecture outside Germany. There are more than 100 houses listed as historical heritage sites scattered along rural roads, surrounded by forests, pastures, and hills. The route has become one of the city's most famous tourist attractions because it allows anyone to see, up close, an architecture that has practically disappeared in Europe but is still alive in the interior of Santa Catarina. And it is in this setting of old houses, traditional families, and a culture passed down from generation to generation that one of the most striking aspects of Pomerode comes into play: the German language. Not as decoration, not as a reminder of great-great-grandfathers, but as a language spoken, taught, and used naturally in everyday life. This does not mean that everyone in the city uses German all the time, but the presence of the language is so strong that it has become part of the local identity. In older families, many grandparents and great-grandparents grew up without speaking Portuguese at home. In some communities further away from the center, it is still common for conversations between neighbors to take place in German or Pomeranian, which is a variation brought by the first immigrants from the Pomerania region. Over time, the city has transformed this heritage into public policy. Pomerode adopted bilingual education, and its students have German classes from an early age. In some classes, even subjects such as history and mathematics are taught in German to reinforce fluency. The goal is not to replace Portuguese, but to keep alive a part of the culture that has shaped the municipality since its inception. This coexistence between two languages also appears in adult life. Many shopkeepers serve tourists in German without effort. Restaurants maintain bilingual menus. Traditional events, such as parades, fairs, and typical festivals, include entire presentations in German. And even those who are not direct descendants end up getting used to hearing and recognizing expressions scattered throughout the city. The language acts as a kind of bridge between the past and the present. On one side, the heritage of the immigrants. On the other, the modern city that was formed there. And this encounter between tradition and everyday life helped transform Pomerode into a cultural experience that goes far beyond the visual. But it is not only the language that attracts visitors. This preserved daily life has become a showcase inside and outside Brazil. Pomerode has appeared in travel magazines, on specialized channels, and even on German websites. In 2023, the cultural portal Deutschlandfunk Kultur published a report describing the municipality as a piece of ancient Pomerania under palm trees. In the article, journalists praise the city's appearance, its traditional festivals, local cuisine, and, above all, the natural way in which residents maintain old customs without seeming to be putting on a show. It is not difficult to understand why. The whole city seems like an open invitation to anyone who wants to experience a little piece of Germany in southern Brazil. The most photographed spot is the tourist portal, built with a half-timbered structure. Many people begin their tour there, in front of the sloping roofs, cross-timbered walls, and flower gardens that line the main street. Everything there is real. Most of the houses are listed, inhabited, and maintained in the same way for over a century. This setting has become the stage for events such as Osterfest, considered the largest Easter festival in the country. There are giant decorated eggs, trees with hand-painted cones, craft stalls, and attractions that spread excitement throughout the city. In addition to Easter, there is a zoo, chocolate factories, breweries, museums, trails, and seasonal festivals that reinforce the cycle of visitors. But the most interesting thing is that all of this started without any tourism planning. It was born from the daily lives of residents who never let their culture be lost. Today, much of the local economy revolves around these visitors who come in search of a different experience within Brazil itself. But the more the city grows, the more it needs to deal with another part of this story. Because the more tourists arrive, the more people talk about it outside the city. And the outside view is not always the same as that of the residents. After getting to know charming Pomerode, with its impeccable half-timbered houses, restaurants steeped in tradition and bilingual routine that enchants visitors, there is another side to the town that rarely appears in tourist materials. This picture was not painted by local residents, but by an outside observer. And not just anyone. He came from one of Germany's most prestigious newspapers, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which sent a reporter to experience the famous most German city in Brazil up close. The view that this journalist took back to Munich was not a pleasant one. According to the article he published, there is a section of the population that takes its German identity so seriously that it goes beyond cultural preservation and enters a much more rigid territory, steeped in prejudice and xenophobia. For this group, belonging does not depend on nationality, but on origin. The journalist reports cases of residents who see Brazilians from other regions as foreigners within Brazil itself. People who say that only those with German blood are real. People who look at Brazilians from outside as if they were invaders, as is the case of one of the local businessmen who said that in the past there was only one black person in the city, but now they are everywhere. In the reporter's words, there is such a closed sense of belonging that it ends up creating social barriers, something far beyond cultural pride, a type of rigid identity that, according to the newspaper, is close to extreme right-wing discourse. The reporter also recounted situations that surprised even German readers. In several passages of the article, the journalist quotes phrases he heard on the streets. One of them came from a local businessman, saying that the city's problems began when migrants from other regions arrived. Another came from the deputy mayor at the time, who commented that those who come from the northeast are not used to Pomerode's standards of cleanliness. It is as if there were an invisible line separating those who were born there from those who came from outside. And the craziest thing is that all this was said naturally, as if it were normal to divide the city between us and them. But what really frightened the journalist was what he called the romanticization of the past. In one of the houses, the police found, by chance, a swimming pool in the shape of a swastika. That's right, that symbol that became known throughout the world because of Hitler's Germany. And note, the owner was a teacher. As the swimming pool was inside the property with no visual access from the street, the case did not go any further, but it made international headlines. However, this was not the only case to attract attention. The reporter also mentioned stickers with the SS symbol, Hitler's personal guard, stuck on cars during traditional festivals. And it was not a protest, it was just decoration, as if it were normal. On other visits, he saw company facades with military elements from Germany's past, old flags hanging, objects with controversial symbols used as if they were neutral historical items. And then comes the most delicate point of all. According to the article, there is a group there that believes that the history of the 20th century has been manipulated, that everything the world has learned about World War II is exaggerated or invented. They say that it was the Allies who distorted the facts. In their view, the Holocaust never happened. It was just a Hollywood invention. And they defend the so-called alternative version of history, and they treat those who think differently as someone who has been deceived. Of course, not everyone thinks this way, and the article makes it clear that this is not the majority opinion in the city. There are many people who work, live, and want to distance themselves from this type of thinking. However, the presence of these groups, even if small, draws attention, especially when they say these things in public, without fear, as if it were just another opinion. The reporter heard something from a German who moved there that sums it all up. He said that, in some ways, Pomerode is more German than Germany itself, but not in a good way. In Germany, certain symbols are banned. Here, they go unnoticed. There, denying history can land you in jail. Here, it becomes bar talk. And perhaps that is why the city arouses so much contradiction. Ultimately, the report does not detract from the beauty of the city or erase its cultural importance, but it shows that there is a lot there that the average tourist does not see, and that the idea of preserving a culture cannot serve as an excuse to repeat the worst side of history. Not in Brazil, not anywhere. So, had you heard of this place before? Tell us in the comments what surprised you most about this video. If you liked the content, leave your like, share it, and of course, don't forget to activate the new hyper feature. This helps the channel gain visibility and continue bringing you these unbelievable trips around our beautiful world. See you next time.